The moment you wake up in the morning, before your eyes fully adjust to the light, something already begins speaking inside you. Not loudly, not clearly, but steadily. A quiet current of words starts moving, shaping how you feel about the day before anything has actually happened. You don't question it. You follow it. And by the time you step into your day, that voice has already decided more than you realize. You call it thinking, but that is not what it is. Thinking suggests something neutral, something observational. What is happening inside you is far more decisive. You are declaring, you are naming, you are assigning meaning before reality has even had a chance to present itself. And once something is named, once something is defined, it begins to behave accordingly. You have been taught to believe that reality is something you encounter, something waiting outside of you, something that presents itself, and then you react. But that sequence is reversed in ways you have never been shown. You are not reacting first. You are setting the frame, quietly, internally, through the words you repeat. And then reality appears inside that frame, matching its shape with unsettling accuracy. Look at how automatic it feels. A situation appears, and almost instantly, a phrase follows it. Not chosen, not examined, just delivered. This is going to be difficult. I don't think I can handle this. This always happens to me. These are not reactions. They are instructions disguised as familiarity, and because they feel familiar, you trust them. Because you trust them, you repeat them. And because you repeat them, they become the structure through which everything else organizes itself. You were never taught to notice this moment, the exact second where something happens and you give it a name. But that moment is where everything begins. Not outside, not in the event itself, but in the way you decide what that event means. And that decision is almost always made through language, through the words that rise inside you without permission. What you consistently say becomes what feels normal, and what feels normal becomes what you stop questioning. That is how patterns solidify, not through force, not through dramatic events, but through repetition so subtle that it escapes your awareness. You don't wake up one day and choose limitation. You repeat it quietly until it becomes the only version of reality that feels believable. And once it feels believable, you stop seeing alternatives, not because they don't exist, but because your language no longer allows them to appear. But here is where everything shifts. And I want you to stay with this, because this is not a motivational idea. This is a structural realization. The voice inside you is not fixed. It was never permanent. It was built. And anything that is built through repetition can be reshaped through awareness, not instantly, not dramatically, but precisely. The moment you begin to notice the words before they settle, something opens. A small gap appears between what happens and what you say about it. And inside that gap, you are no longer automatic. You are no longer just continuing a pattern. You are present. And presence is where choice returns. You don't need to control every word. That would only create tension. But you do need to recognize that the words you allow to repeat unchecked are not harmless. They are directional. They guide perception. They filter experience. They reinforce identity. And once they stabilize, they begin to feel like truth. Even if they were never chosen consciously, you are not discovering something new. You are recognizing something that has always been happening. Long before you tried to change your life, you were already shaping it. Not through effort, not through action, but through agreement. Quiet, repeated agreement with what you believed was possible, what you believed was fixed, what you believed was simply how things are. And every one of those agreements was spoken, whether out loud or within. Nothing you have been experiencing is separate from that process. And once you begin to hear it clearly, not occasionally, not when you are trying, but consistently, you will notice something unsettling at first. The world has been responding to you all along, not to what you want, not to what you hope for, but to what you have been steadily confirming, not loudly, just often enough. A single sentence, repeated often enough, can become something you no longer recognize as a sentence. It turns into a tone, then a mood, then a baseline that quietly colors everything you experience. You don't hear it clearly anymore because it blends into you. Like background music you stopped noticing years ago, Yet it is still playing, still setting the pace, still deciding how every moment feels before you even react to it. That is how the inner voice works, not as something loud or obvious, but as something continuous. You are not just thinking throughout the day. You are narrating. You are interpreting everything in real time, assigning meaning to what happens before you even realize you have done it. And the problem is not that this voice exists. The problem is that you have mistaken it for truth. Listen closely to how fast it moves. Something small happens, and instantly a conclusion appears. You hesitate for a second, and the voice says, "You're not ready. You make a mistake." And it says, "You always mess this up." You see someone else succeed, and without warning, it whispers, "That's not for you." None of these statements arrive as questions. They arrive as facts, and because they arrive with certainty, you rarely stop to examine them. But certainty does not mean accuracy. It means repetition. This voice learned its tone from what it heard over time. It gathered fragments from experiences, from other people, from past outcomes, and it began repeating them until they formed a pattern. At some point, that pattern became familiar enough that you stopped noticing it as something separate. It became your voice. It became you. But it is not you. It is a script, and the reason it feels so convincing is because it has been repeated without interruption. The more something is repeated, the less resistance it encounters. The less resistance it encounters, the more it settles. And once it settles, it stops feeling like something you can change. It starts feeling like something you must accept. This is how identity forms without intention. You don't decide who you are in a single moment. You reinforce it through thousands of small internal statements that go unchallenged. You say something about yourself. You repeat it. You feel it. And then you begin to act as if it is already established. Not because you proved it, but because you heard it enough times to believe it. And once you believe it, your perception begins to adjust accordingly. You notice evidence that supports it. You overlook anything that contradicts it. You interpret neutral situations in ways that confirm it. And before long, your external experience appears to validate the very voice that created it. It becomes a loop. The voice shapes your perception. Your perception shapes your experience. Your experience reinforces the voice. And because this loop feels seamless, you assume it is reality itself. You assume that what you are experiencing is simply the way things are, when in fact, it is the result of a conversation you have been having with yourself for years. This is why two people can live in the same environment and experience completely different realities. Not because the world treats them differently, but because they are not listening to the same voice. One reinforces possibility, the other reinforces limitation, and each one sees exactly what they have been prepared to see. The inner voice does not create reality directly. It filters it so precisely that the result feels identical. That is what makes it so difficult to notice. You are not seeing a distorted version of reality. You are seeing a selected version of it, one that aligns perfectly with what you have been repeating internally. Everything that does not match is simply ignored, dismissed, or explained away. And the longer this continues, the more stable it becomes. You stop questioning the voice because it keeps being confirmed, and it keeps being confirmed because you stopped questioning it. That is the cycle. Breaking it does not require force. It requires awareness, not the kind of awareness that comes and goes, but the kind that allows you to hear the voice as it speaks, in real time, without immediately agreeing with it. Because the moment you hear it clearly, something subtle happens. It separates from you, even if only slightly. It stops being you and starts being something you can observe. That shift is small, but it changes everything, because once you can observe it, you are no longer fully inside it. And if you are not fully inside it, you are no longer bound to repeat it automatically. You may still hear it, but you don't have to follow it with the same certainty. At first, nothing dramatic happens. The voice continues. The patterns are still there. The same phrases appear in familiar situations. But something is different. There is space, and in that space, choice begins to reappear, not as a struggle, not as a battle against your thoughts, but as a quiet recognition that what you are hearing is not fixed. It is not final. It is simply repeated. And repetition can be redirected, not by forcing new statements aggressively, not by trying to silence the old ones, but by introducing something different, gently, consistently, without needing it to feel natural immediately. Because what feels natural is simply what has been practiced the most. You are not trying to become someone new. You are interrupting a pattern that has been running without your permission, and that interruption does not happen all at once. It happens in moments, in small pauses, in the brief second where you notice what the voice is about to say, and instead of following it blindly, you allow something else to exist alongside it. At first, that something else feels weak, uncertain, almost insignificant compared to the familiar tone of the old voice. But that is only because it has not been repeated enough yet. Strength in the mind does not come from truth. It comes from frequency, and once you understand that, you stop being intimidated by how convincing the old voice sounds. You begin to see it for what it is, a well-practiced pattern. Nothing more. And patterns, no matter how deeply ingrained, are not permanent. They only appear that way because they have never been interrupted long enough to change direction. The moment you begin to hear the voice instead of becoming it, that direction begins to shift, even if nothing else around you has changed yet. A rhythm is already running your life, whether you notice it or not, and it did not begin with a decision. It did not arrive as a single belief. It was built slowly, quietly, through repetition so consistent that it became invisible. Like a pulse you no longer feel, but that continues to keep everything alive. You are not shaped by what you say once, not even by what you say with intensity. You are shaped by what you return to, again and again, until it becomes the background against which everything else is measured. Watch how this works in the simplest moments. You wake up, and before anything has happened, a familiar tone appears, not a clear sentence, not something you consciously choose, but a direction. It colors the morning before the day has even begun. Maybe it leans toward resistance, maybe toward doubt, maybe toward pressure. But whatever it is, it does not feel new. It feels known, and because it feels known, you don't question it. You move with it. That is rhythm. It is not loud. It does not demand your attention. It repeats, and repetition is what gives it authority. You have been trained to look for dramatic change, for a moment that shifts everything at once. But the system shaping your life does not operate in that way. It does not respond to occasional bursts of intention. It responds to consistency, to what is repeated without interruption, to what becomes so familiar that it no longer feels like something you are choosing, but something that simply is. This is how identity is installed, not declared once, but rehearsed. Every phrase you repeat about yourself, every quiet conclusion you return to, every small statement that feels obvious over time. They begin to form a pattern, and once a pattern stabilizes, it becomes a reference point. You stop checking whether it is true. You start using it to interpret everything else. It becomes the lens, not the object. And once something becomes the lens, it disappears from your awareness. You don't see it. You see through it. That is why repetition is so powerful. Not because it convinces you in a dramatic way, but because it removes the need for convincing altogether. It becomes normal, and what is normal is what you expect. And what you expect is what you begin to notice. And what you notice is what you experience more of. You are not chasing reality. You are reinforcing a pattern that selects it. This is why a single negative statement, repeated often enough, can outweigh dozens of positive ones spoken occasionally. Not because it is stronger, but because it is consistent. It has rhythm. It returns without effort. It does not need to be remembered. It is already there, and anything that is already there will always dominate something that appears only occasionally. You have seen this in your own life. Even if you never named it, there are certain beliefs that feel immovable, not because you tested them thoroughly, but because you have heard them so many times that they feel unquestionable. This is just how I am. Things like that don't happen for me. It always goes this way. These are not conclusions. They are rehearsals that became permanent. But what you call permanent is simply uninterrupted repetition, nothing more. And if repetition is what created the pattern, then repetition is also what can reshape it. Not instantly, not through force, but through persistence that is quiet enough to last. Most people fail here because they try to replace a pattern with intensity instead of rhythm. They say something new once or twice, expecting it to feel real immediately. But it doesn't. It feels unfamiliar, unstable, disconnected, and because it doesn't feel natural, they abandon it, returning to what does feel natural, even if it limits them. But natural does not mean true. It means practiced. You are not trying to convince yourself of something new. You are training a new rhythm, and rhythm does not come from effort. It comes from return, from saying something again when you forget, from noticing when the old pattern reappears and gently placing something else beside it, not fighting it, not suppressing it, just introducing something different, repeatedly, until it begins to settle. At first, the new pattern feels weak. It does not carry the same weight. It does not feel as convincing. But that is not because it lacks truth. It is because it lacks history. And history is built through repetition. Over time, something subtle begins to happen. The new statements do not feel as foreign. They begin to appear more easily. You don't have to search for them as much. They start to come on their own. And when they come on their own, they begin to form rhythm. That is the turning point. Not when you believe something fully, but when it begins to repeat without effort. Because once it repeats without effort, it starts to replace the old baseline. And when the baseline shifts, your expectations shift. And when your expectations shift, your perception reorganizes. And when perception reorganizes, your experience begins to follow. This is how destiny is programmed. Not in a single moment, not through a grand realization, but through the quiet persistence of what you return to most often. You have been programming your current reality for years without realizing it. Not intentionally, not consciously, but consistently. And consistency is what matters. So now the question is not whether you can change your life. The question is what you are willing to repeat, because whatever you repeat becomes your rhythm. Whatever becomes your rhythm becomes your normal, and whatever becomes your normal becomes your reality. You are not waiting for a different future. You are rehearsing it. Every day, whether you notice it or not. Walk into a room after an argument and you can feel it before a single word is spoken. A thickness in the air, a tension that does not belong to the walls, yet somehow fills them. And you immediately adjust your tone, your posture, your presence without anyone instructing you to do so. You have experienced this countless times. Moments where something invisible shapes everything visible, where what is in the air becomes more real than what you can actually touch. And yet, you were taught to dismiss that sensitivity, to call it mood, coincidence, imagination. But it is none of those. It is response. The world responds long before you consciously understand what you are sending into it. You were told that matter is solid, to separate, indifferent, something that exists independently of you, something you must navigate, endure, or control. But what if that assumption was incomplete? What if what you call the world is not as fixed as it appears, not as distant as it feels, not as silent as you think? Because everything you interact with carries structure, and structure responds to pattern, and your words, especially the ones you repeat with consistency, are patterns. You are not speaking into emptiness. You are speaking into a field that is already sensitive to alignment. This is not about objects having ears or awareness in the way you understand it. It is about resonance, the same principle that allows you to feel tension in a room, the same mechanism that makes certain environments feel heavy and others feel open. That same responsiveness extends far beyond what you consciously notice. The tone you carry, the assumptions you repeat, the language you live in internally, all of it contributes to the way your environment organizes itself around you. You have seen this in subtle ways, days where everything seems to cooperate, where timing aligns, where interactions feel effortless, where even small tasks move smoothly as if something is assisting you from behind the scenes, and other days where nothing quite fits, where delays stack, where simple things become complicated, where resistance appears in places that should have been neutral. You call this luck, circumstance, coincidence, but it is not random. It is patterned, and patterns respond to patterns. The words you repeat internally are not isolated from your environment. They set a tone, and that tone carries forward into how you move, how you speak, how you interpret, how you react, and those reactions create feedback, subtle adjustments in your surroundings that begin to mirror the state you are carrying, not because the world is conscious in the way you imagine, but because it is coherent. It aligns. If your internal language carries tension, expectation of difficulty, anticipation of resistance, that tension expresses itself outwardly. You approach situations slightly guarded, slightly hesitant, slightly prepared for something to go wrong, and that subtle shift changes everything. It changes how others respond to you. It changes how you interpret their responses. It changes how you move through tasks. And those changes accumulate until your environment appears to confirm what you felt from the beginning. But it began inside you. Now reverse it. Not as a forced positivity, but as a shift in alignment. When your internal dialogue carries steadiness, when your language is not fighting the moment but moving with it, something else emerges. Your movements become less rigid. Your tone becomes more open. Your reactions become less defensive. And that openness invites a different kind of response from the world around you. You are not commanding reality like a separate authority. You are participating in a system that organizes itself based on coherence. And coherence begins with intention. Not the words themselves, but the state behind them. You can say the same sentence in two completely different ways. One carrying doubt, the other carrying certainty. And the result will not be the same. Not because the words changed, but because the alignment did. The world does not respond to vocabulary. It responds to consistency between what you say and what you carry. This is why empty affirmations fail. Not because affirmations are ineffective, but because they are often disconnected from the internal state that supports them. When there is contradiction, when the words move in one direction, but the underlying tone moves in another, the signal is split. And a split signal cannot stabilize into a clear pattern. But when there is alignment, even the simplest statement becomes powerful. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is coherent. It does not conflict with itself. It does not carry resistance beneath the surface. It moves in one direction, steadily, without interruption. And that steadiness is what the world responds to. You have been influencing your environment this entire time, not through effort, but through consistency of state. The difference now is awareness. You are beginning to see that what you say is not separate from what unfolds, that your words are not just internal commentary but part of the structure that shapes your experience. This does not mean you must control every thought or monitor every word. That would create tension, and tension breaks alignment. What it means is that you begin to notice the tone you carry, the patterns you repeat, the assumptions you reinforce without realizing it. And in that noticing, something shifts. You start to choose differently, not all at once, not perfectly, but consistently enough to alter the rhythm. And once the rhythm changes, the environment begins to follow, not immediately, not dramatically, but noticeably. Small things adjust first. Timing feels slightly smoother. Interactions feel less forced. Situations that once created resistance begin to move with less friction. And these small adjustments accumulate until the difference becomes undeniable. Not as a miracle, but as a natural consequence of alignment. You are not separate from what you experience. You are not outside of it, observing it from a distance. You are inside a continuous exchange, shaping and being shaped at the same time. And your words, especially the ones you repeat without thinking, are one of the primary ways that exchange is guided. Nothing around you is as indifferent as it appears. And once you begin to recognize how sensitive your environment is to the patterns you carry, you stop treating your words as temporary. You begin to see them as structural, as something that does not disappear after it is spoken, but continues, extends, organizes, until it returns to you in a form you can no longer ignore. Say something once, and it fades. Say it twice, and it lingers. Say it often enough, and it begins to behave like a rule. Not because anyone enforced it, but because you kept returning to it until it stopped feeling optional. That is how your words move from being expressions into becoming commands, not declared with authority, not announced with intention, but repeated with such quiet certainty that reality has no reason to treat them as anything else. You have been issuing these commands for years without realizing it, not through grand statements, not through dramatic affirmations, but through the small, consistent phrases that feel almost too ordinary to question, the ones that slip out in passing, the ones you repeat under your breath, the ones you say about yourself, about your life, about what is possible and what is not. And because they feel casual, you assume they carry no weight. But it is exactly that casual repetition that gives them power. A command does not require volume. It requires consistency. Look closely at how this unfolds. You say, "This always takes longer than it should," and nothing seems to happen immediately. The day continues, but the next time a delay appears, the same phrase returns, then again, in a different situation, and again, in another form. Each repetition strengthens the pattern, not visibly, not dramatically, but structurally, until eventually, delay is no longer something that occasionally happens. It becomes something that feels expected. And once something feels expected, your perception aligns with it. You notice it faster. You anticipate it earlier. You interpret neutral moments as confirmation. And that interpretation feeds the next repetition. The loop closes. From the outside, it looks like reality is causing the experience. From the inside, it is your repeated command being reflected with precision. This is what makes the law exact. It does not exaggerate your words. It does not distort them. It does not reinterpret them in a way that benefits you. It simply mirrors the pattern you have stabilized. If your language carries limitation, the reflection carries limitation. If your language carries possibility, the reflection carries possibility. Not because the world prefers one over the other, but because it aligns with whatever you consistently reinforce. And here is where most people misunderstand what they are doing. They believe they are asking for something different than what they are experiencing. They say they want ease, but they speak about difficulty all day. They say they want success, but they repeat doubt every time they face something uncertain. They say they want change, but they constantly describe themselves in ways that preserve the same identity. The system does not respond to what you want occasionally. It responds to what you declare consistently. You are not being misunderstood. You are being reflected with accuracy. This is why occasional positivity has little effect. Saying something once, even with strong emotion, does not override a pattern that has been repeated hundreds of times with quiet certainty. The system is not impressed by intensity. It is shaped by repetition. And repetition, over time, becomes structure. But the moment you understand this, something shifts in how you speak, not because you are trying to control every word, but because you begin to recognize what your words are doing. You see that each statement you repeat is not just describing your experience. It is stabilizing it. It is reinforcing the direction your reality will continue to move. And that awareness changes your relationship with language. You start to notice the phrases that appear automatically, the ones that feel natural but limit what follows. You hear them more clearly, and in hearing them, you create a small space, just enough to interrupt the pattern, not by forcing something new, but by refusing to reinforce what you no longer want to continue. This is where redirection begins. You do not need to replace every thought instantly. That would be artificial. But you can choose what you allow to repeat. You can choose what you stabilize. You can choose which patterns you continue to confirm and which ones you let dissolve through lack of repetition. Because without repetition, even the strongest patterns begin to weaken. And as they weaken, something else becomes possible. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped reinforcing the structure that was holding it in place. The absence of repetition creates space. And in that space, new patterns can emerge. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily. Over time, you begin to notice that certain statements no longer feel automatic. They lose their familiarity. They no longer return as easily. And in their place, something else begins to repeat. Something that once felt unnatural now starts to appear more often, more easily, with less effort. That is the moment the command has changed. Not when you say something once, but when it begins to repeat on its own. Because once a statement becomes automatic, once it becomes part of your internal rhythm, it no longer feels like something you are choosing. It feels like something that simply is. And whatever feels like what is, becomes the baseline from which your reality organizes itself. This is how precise the system is. It does not respond to effort. It responds to pattern. It does not measure intention. It reflects repetition, and once you see that clearly, you stop treating your words as temporary. You begin to understand that every phrase you return to is shaping the structure you will continue to live inside. You have not been waiting for reality to change. You have been reinforcing the same command, over and over again, until it became stable enough to feel permanent. And now, whether you continue that pattern or shift it, will not be decided in a single moment, but in what you choose to repeat next. You can tell the direction your life is moving without looking at your circumstances, without analyzing your results, without trying to predict anything at all. Just listen to how you speak when something doesn't go your way. Not the words you choose carefully, not the ones you say when you are trying to stay positive, but the ones that come out immediately, without effort, without filtering. That moment reveals everything, because it shows you the pattern you trust the most. Most people believe they are reacting to life, but what you call reaction is often repetition. The same phrases surface again and again, slightly different in wording but identical in meaning, forming a current that runs beneath your entire day. And what makes it powerful is not how dramatic it sounds, but how familiar it feels. Familiar enough that you don't question it. Familiar enough that you keep returning to it without realizing that each return strengthens its direction. This is where complaint operates, not as something loud or obvious, but as something continuous. It does not require intensity. It only requires repetition. You say something once. It passes. You say it again in another situation. It begins to settle. You say it enough times across different moments, and suddenly it no longer feels like something you are saying. It feels like something that is simply true. And once it feels true, everything starts organizing around it. Notice how quickly this expands. A delay happens, and the phrase appears, "This always takes too long." Another inconvenience shows up, and it connects itself to the same idea. By the end of the day, multiple unrelated events have been grouped into a single pattern, not because they are identical, but because your language made them so. You stitch them together through repetition, and now they move as one. This is how direction is established. You are not just experiencing isolated moments. You are building continuity. Every complaint adds another layer, another confirmation, another reason for the pattern to feel stable. And once a pattern stabilizes, it no longer needs to prove itself. It begins to expect itself. And expectation is where perception starts to narrow, selecting only what matches, filtering out everything else. But what makes this even more precise is that the system you are in does not distinguish between what you want and what you repeat. It does not prioritize your desires. It prioritizes your consistency. And consistency is built through language. Now shift your attention, not to force anything, but to observe something you may have overlooked. There are moments, even brief ones, where you speak differently, not because you are trying, but because something feels lighter. You acknowledge something working. You recognize something going well. You express appreciation, even in a small way. And in those moments, something subtle changes. The situation itself may not transform instantly, but your relationship to it does. The tension reduces, the resistance softens, and that shift, however small, alters how you move next. You respond differently, you interpret differently, and that change begins to influence what follows. This is where gratitude operates, not as an emotion you force, but as a direction you establish. It does not need to be dramatic. It does not need to ignore what is missing. It simply needs to be consistent enough to form a pattern, because once it becomes a pattern, it begins to stabilize in the same way complaint does. It becomes familiar, it becomes natural, and eventually, it becomes the default way you interpret your experience. The difference between complaint and gratitude is not about positivity versus negativity. It is about contraction versus expansion. Complaint narrows your field of attention, focusing on what is not working, reinforcing it until it dominates your perception. Gratitude expands your field, allowing more to be noticed, more to be included, more to be acknowledged, and whatever you consistently acknowledge begins to multiply in presence, not because something new is being created out of nowhere, but because your perception is no longer filtering it out. You begin to see what was always there but previously ignored, And as you see it more often, you reinforce it. And as you reinforce it, it becomes more prominent. The cycle continues, but in a different direction. This is not about forcing yourself to feel grateful. That approach rarely lasts. It is about recognizing what you are already reinforcing and deciding whether you want to continue in that direction. Because every repeated statement is a reinforcement, whether you intend it or not. You do not need to eliminate complaints completely. That would be unrealistic. But you do need to notice how often they repeat, how easily they connect, how quickly they form patterns. And in that noticing, something becomes available to you that was not there before. Interruption, not suppression, not denial, just interruption. The moment you catch the pattern before it completes itself, you create a break in the rhythm, and even a small break is enough to prevent the pattern from stabilizing further. You are not replacing it immediately. You are loosening its hold, and once it begins to loosen, it no longer feels inevitable. At the same time, you begin to allow a different pattern to repeat. Not perfectly, not consistently at first, but enough to begin forming its own rhythm. And as that rhythm strengthens, it starts to feel more natural, not because it suddenly became true, but because it has been repeated enough to feel familiar. Familiarity is what determines what feels real, and this is where direction becomes clear. You are not waiting for circumstances to change before you speak differently. You are speaking differently so that circumstances can reorganize around a new pattern. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily. As the old repetition weakens and the new one stabilizes, you have been setting direction through your words this entire time. Not intentionally, but consistently. And now, as you begin to notice it, you are no longer moving without awareness. You are no longer reinforcing patterns without recognizing their impact. The question is no longer whether your words matter. That has already been answered by the patterns you are living inside. The question now is which direction you are willing to repeat long enough for it to become real. You can say all the right words and still change nothing. And that is where most people become confused, because they assume that language alone carries power, that if they repeat the correct phrases often enough, something must eventually shift. But what they overlook is far more subtle and far more decisive. It is not just what you say. It is whether what you say is moving in the same direction as what you actually feel, what you actually expect, what you have quietly already agreed to beneath the surface. Because the moment there is a split, the moment your words move one way while your inner state moves another, the signal breaks. Not partially, completely. You have experienced this, even if you never named it, saying something you want to believe, but feeling something entirely different at the same time, declaring confidence while carrying hesitation, speaking about abundance while anticipating lack. Outwardly, the words sound correct. Internally, something resists them, and that resistance is not neutral. It is active. When contradiction exists, the system does not average your words and your feelings. It does not try to balance them. It follows the stronger pattern, and the stronger pattern is almost always the one that has been repeated longer, the one that feels more familiar, the one that does not require effort to maintain. That is why forced language rarely works. You can repeat a statement with intensity, with effort, with determination, but if beneath that effort there is doubt, hesitation, or quiet disbelief, the overall pattern remains divided, and division does not stabilize into anything clear. It creates interference. It slows momentum. It keeps reality from organizing in a consistent direction. This is not because you are doing something wrong. It is because the system responds to coherence, not intention. Coherence means your words, your tone, your expectation, and your internal state are moving together. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but without contradiction. When that happens, something becomes possible that cannot happen otherwise. The signal becomes clear. It stops cancelling itself. It begins to carry forward without resistance. And that is when even simple language begins to have weight. But when contradiction exists, even the most carefully chosen words lose their effect, not because they lack meaning, but because they are not supported by the state beneath them. They are isolated, and isolated statements do not form patterns. They fade before they can stabilize. Look at how often this happens in subtle ways. You say, "This will work out," but immediately follow it with an expectation that it might not. You tell yourself, I can handle this, but your body remains tense, preparing for difficulty. You declare something once, but your internal dialogue returns to the opposite pattern repeatedly throughout the day. It is not the single statement that matters. It is what you return to. And what you return to is not decided by what you want. It is decided by what feels natural. This is why alignment cannot be forced. It must be built. You cannot simply choose new words and expect them to override an old pattern that has been repeated for years. That creates more contradiction, not less. Instead, alignment emerges gradually, as the gap between what you say and what you feel begins to close. And that closing does not happen through pressure. It happens through consistency. You begin by noticing where the contradiction exists, not trying to eliminate it, not judging it, but seeing it clearly. Hearing the difference between what you say and what you expect. Feeling the tension when your words do not match your internal state. And in that awareness, something shifts, because once you see the contradiction, you can no longer pretend it is not there. That does not mean it disappears immediately, but it becomes visible. And once it is visible, it begins to lose its automatic control. You are no longer fully inside it. You are observing it, and in that observation, you begin to adjust, not by forcing yourself to believe something you do not, but by choosing language that you can actually stand behind, even if only partially at first. You move from exaggeration to accuracy, from forced certainty to grounded direction. You choose statements that do not conflict with your current state, but gently guide it forward. Because alignment is not about jumping from doubt to absolute certainty in a single step. It is about reducing contradiction until your words and your state begin to move together. At first, the shift is small. The tension is still there, but it is less intense. The resistance is still present, but it is less dominant. And as you continue, as you repeat language that does not conflict with your internal state, something begins to stabilize. Your words no longer feel separate from you. They begin to feel integrated, natural. And when they feel natural, they begin to repeat on their own. That is the moment alignment begins to take hold, because once your words repeat without effort, and they are supported by your internal state, the signal becomes clear. It no longer splits. It no longer cancels itself. It moves in one direction, and when it moves in one direction, reality begins to organize around that direction. Not instantly, not dramatically, but consistently. Situations begin to unfold with less resistance. Decisions feel less conflicted. Your perception becomes more stable, and that stability creates momentum, not because you forced anything to change, but because you removed the internal contradiction that was preventing movement. You are not trying to control reality. You are aligning with it, and alignment is not something you declare once. It is something you maintain through what you consistently repeat, without conflict. The moment your words and your internal state stop pulling in opposite directions, you will notice something that cannot be explained through effort alone. Things begin to move with less friction, not because the world suddenly changed, but because you are no longer dividing the signal you are sending into it. Power does not come from saying the right thing. It comes from saying something that is supported by the state you actually carry. And once that support becomes consistent, your words stop feeling like attempts. They start behaving like direction. Think about the last time something worked without you trying to make it work. When the right words came out without effort. When decisions felt obvious instead of heavy. When actions unfolded without resistance. And everything seemed to move with a quiet precision you didn't have to control. You didn't force it. You didn't overthink it. You didn't rehearse it. And yet, it aligned. That moment was not luck. It was not coincidence. It was what happens when you are no longer pushing against your own direction. What you experienced there was flow, not as a concept, not as something mystical, but as a state where your inner dialogue stops interfering, where your words are no longer trying to correct, justify, or compensate for something beneath them. They move naturally because they are not divided. There is no gap between what you say and what you carry. No contradiction. No pressure. No effort to convince yourself of something you don't yet believe. And that is the difference between forced speech and aligned speech. Most of what you have been taught about changing your life is built around effort. Say this more often. Repeat this louder. Focus harder. Try to maintain the right mindset. But effort, when it comes from tension, creates friction, and friction disrupts alignment. The more you try to force your words into a direction that your internal state does not support, the more resistance you generate, not because the method is wrong, but because the state is not ready to carry it. Flow does not come from effort, it comes from coherence. When your internal language stabilizes, when the patterns you repeat no longer conflict with what you feel, something shifts. Your words stop feeling like tools you are using, and start feeling like something that simply emerges. You don't have to search for them. You don't have to monitor them. They appear on their own, because they are supported by the rhythm you have already established. And this is where manifestation begins to feel natural instead of forced. Because when your speech flows, your actions follow the same pattern. You don't hesitate as much. You don't overanalyze every step. You don't prepare for resistance before it happens. You move. And that movement is not random. It is guided by the same alignment that is shaping your words. Notice how different this feels from effort. Effort feels heavy. It feels like something you must maintain. It requires constant attention. But flow feels light. It sustains itself. It continues without needing to be pushed, because nothing inside you is interrupting it. This is why trying to force manifestation often leads to the opposite result. Not because the goal is wrong, but because the approach creates internal tension. You say one thing, but you feel another. You push forward, but you are preparing for resistance at the same time. You try to control the outcome, but that control is rooted in doubt, and that doubt splits the signal. Flow removes that split. It does not eliminate effort completely, but it removes unnecessary resistance. The energy you are using to fight yourself becomes available for movement, and when movement becomes smooth, things begin to organize differently, not because you made them, but because you stopped interfering with the direction they were already trying to take. You can see this in the simplest situations. Conversations that go well are not the ones where you carefully plan every sentence. They are the ones where you are present enough to respond naturally. Creative ideas do not appear when you force them. They appear when you stop trying to control the process. Solutions emerge not when you push harder, but when you allow space for them to surface. Flow is not passive. It is responsive. It requires awareness, but not control. It requires presence, but not pressure. And most importantly, it requires that your internal dialogue is no longer working against the direction you are trying to move. This is why everything we have built so far matters. The patterns you repeat, the alignment you establish, the contradictions you dissolve, all of it leads to this point. Because flow is not something you activate directly. It is something that emerges when resistance is no longer dominant. You don't create flow, you allow it. And allowing it does not mean doing nothing. It means no longer forcing what does not align. It means no longer repeating patterns that create tension. It means recognizing when your words are trying to control instead of reflect a stable internal state. At first, this may feel unfamiliar. You are used to effort. You are used to trying. You are used to managing every step. Letting things move without that level of control can feel uncertain. But that uncertainty is not danger. It is the absence of the old pattern. And as you stay with it, something changes. Your words become simpler. You stop over-explaining. You stop adding unnecessary conditions. You say what aligns, and then you move. And that simplicity carries more power than any forced affirmation ever could, because it is not divided. Your actions follow the same pattern. Less hesitation, less internal conflict, more direct movement. Not because you are pushing harder, but because nothing inside you is holding you back in subtle ways, and the world begins to respond accordingly. Not as a sudden transformation, but as a gradual shift in how things unfold. Timing feels less obstructed. Opportunities appear in ways that feel natural. Interactions become smoother, not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer approaching everything with resistance. Flow does not remove challenge. It removes unnecessary friction. And when friction is reduced, even complex situations begin to move with a kind of ease that feels almost unfamiliar at first. But that unfamiliarity fades as the state stabilizes, as your words, your actions, and your expectations begin to move together without conflict. You are not chasing outcomes anymore. You are moving in alignment with a direction that no longer needs to be forced. And when that alignment becomes consistent, you stop asking whether things will work. You stop preparing for resistance before it appears. You stop trying to control every variable. You move, and the movement continues. You can want something with intensity and still never experience it. Not because the desire is weak, not because you are incapable, but because desire by itself does not stabilize anything. Desire moves. It reaches. It stretches towards something that is not yet felt as real. And in that reaching, it carries a subtle tension, a quiet gap between where you are and where you think you need to be. And that gap is where doubt lives. Not loudly, not always consciously, but steadily enough to interrupt whatever direction you are trying to establish. Desire says, I want this. Certainty says, this is already mine. And those two are not close to each other. You have been taught to amplify desire, to want more strongly, to visualize more clearly, to feel more intensely, as if increasing the force of wanting will somehow pull reality closer. But wanting, no matter how strong it feels, still implies absence. It keeps the thing you want positioned in front of you, always just out of reach, always something you are moving toward but never fully standing inside. And the system you are operating within does not respond to what you are reaching for. It responds to what you stand in. This is where everything begins to shift. Because the moment you move from desire into certainty, something collapses, the distance disappears, the tension dissolves. The internal movement toward something becomes a stable position within it. You are no longer chasing an outcome. You are speaking from within it. But this is the part that feels almost impossible at first. Because certainty cannot be faked. You cannot simply say something is already yours while your entire internal state is still organized around not having it. That creates contradiction, and contradiction, as you have seen, breaks the signal. So the transition from desire to certainty is not a jump. It is a shift in what you are reinforcing. Look at how doubt actually forms. It does not arrive as a single strong statement. It builds through small interruptions. You say something aligned, and then immediately qualify it. You imagine something working, and then prepare for it not to. You declare something once, and then return to old patterns repeatedly throughout the day. Each of these moments may seem insignificant, but together, they create instability, and instability prevents certainty from forming. Certainty is not about intensity. It is about consistency without interruption. You do not need to feel powerful all the time. You do not need to eliminate every trace of doubt instantly. But you do need to recognize how often you reintroduce doubt through repetition. Because every time you return to it, you reset the pattern. You break the continuity that certainty requires. This is why most people remain in desire. Not because they lack ability, but because they keep interrupting their own direction. They establish a pattern briefly, and then dissolve it before it has time to stabilize. Over and over again. But when you stop interrupting, something begins to settle. Not dramatically, not in a way that feels overwhelming, but quietly, like something locking into place. Your words begin to feel less like attempts and more like statements. You no longer need to reinforce them constantly. You don't need to check them. You don't need to prove them. They hold their position on their own. That is the beginning of certainty. And once certainty begins to form, your perception changes in a way that is difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. You stop looking for signs. You stop searching for validation. You stop measuring progress constantly, not because you don't care, but because the internal position you are standing in no longer depends on external confirmation. You already decided, and that decision, when not interrupted, becomes stable. This is where manifestation starts to feel different, not faster in a dramatic sense, but more direct, less scattered, more precise. Because you are no longer sending mixed signals. You are no longer oscillating between wanting and doubting. You are maintaining a single direction, and the system responds to that clarity, not because it rewards you, but because there is nothing left to interpret. The pattern is stable. The signal is continuous. And when a signal is continuous, it organizes everything around it. You begin to notice that your reactions shift. Situations that would have triggered doubt no longer do, not because you are forcing yourself to stay positive, but because doubt no longer feels as familiar. It does not return as easily. It does not repeat with the same strength. And without repetition, it cannot stabilize. This is how doubt collapses, not through force, not through suppression, but through lack of reinforcement. You are not trying to eliminate doubt completely. You are simply not feeding it anymore. And without consistent input, even the strongest patterns weaken. They lose their authority. They stop defining your direction. At the same time, certainty strengthens, not because you push it, but because you allow it to repeat without interruption. It becomes your default. It becomes what you return to automatically. And once it becomes automatic, it no longer feels like something you are maintaining. It feels like something that is already established. This is the difference. Desire keeps you moving towards something. Certainty places you within it. And once you are within it, everything else begins to reorganize. Not because you forced it to happen, but because you stopped standing outside of it. You are no longer asking whether it will work. You are no longer preparing for it not to. You are no longer dividing your direction. You are holding it. And when you hold something without interruption, without contradiction, without returning to old patterns that weaken it, you are no longer creating in fragments. You are creating continuously. And continuous creation does not need intensity. It needs stability. Hold an object in your hand for a moment. Something ordinary. Something you've touched 100 times without thinking: a cup, a pen, a key, and notice how easily you assume it has nothing to do with your inner world, as if it exists on its own, separate, neutral, untouched by anything you say or feel. That assumption feels obvious, almost unquestionable, and yet it hides something essential. Because what you call physical reality is not isolated from you in the way you were taught to believe. It is shaped, influenced, and subtly organized by the patterns you carry into it. And your words are one of the most direct ways those patterns take form. You have been speaking internally for a long time, shaping perception, guiding interpretation, influencing how you experience situations. But at some point, that inner structure begins to express itself outwardly. It does not stay contained. It moves into how you act, how you move, how you interact with people, how you handle objects, how you approach tasks. And that is where your words begin to anchor themselves in the physical world. This is not about saying something and watching an object magically change in front of you. It is more precise than that. It is about how your internal language becomes embedded in your behavior, and how that behavior begins to alter the outcomes you encounter. The same action, performed under different internal states, produces different results, not because the action itself changed, but because the way you carried it did. Think about the difference between doing something while expecting it to fail and doing the same thing while assuming it will work. The movement looks similar from the outside, but internally, everything is different. The timing shifts. The attention shifts. The small adjustments you make along the way shift, and those subtle differences accumulate until the outcome reflects the expectation that guided it. Your words are not just influencing your thoughts, they are shaping your execution. Every task you approach is already filtered through the language you have repeated before you even begin. If your internal dialogue is filled with hesitation, the way you move reflects it. If your words carry certainty, your actions align with that direction. You are not consciously controlling every detail, but your body is responding to the pattern you have stabilized internally, and that response affects how things unfold. This is how words become physical, not by bypassing reality, but by guiding the way you move through it. You do not need to force the world to change. You need to recognize that the way you are already interacting with it is being shaped by what you have been saying to yourself. And once you see that clearly, you begin to understand how to anchor a different pattern. Anchoring is not about repetition alone. It is about connection. You can repeat a phrase in isolation, and it may influence your internal state. But when that phrase is connected to something tangible, something you interact with regularly, it begins to settle deeper. It moves from abstraction into experience. It becomes part of your environment. This is why certain habits feel more stable than others. Not because they are stronger, but because they are tied to physical actions. You don't just think them, you live them. And anything that is lived repeatedly becomes embedded. So when you speak something aligned and then carry that alignment into your actions, into your interactions, into the way you handle even the smallest tasks, you are not just reinforcing it mentally, you are installing it physically. You begin to notice this in subtle ways. The way you write changes. The way you organize things shifts. The way you respond to people becomes more consistent. You are not trying to perform differently. You simply are different in how you move, because the pattern beneath your movement has changed. And once that pattern stabilizes, the physical world begins to reflect it, not as a sudden transformation, but as a gradual adjustment in outcomes. Tasks that once felt difficult begin to move more smoothly. Situations that used to create resistance begin to unfold with less friction. Interactions that felt uncertain begin to feel more direct. It is not that the world itself changed dramatically. It is that your way of engaging with it has shifted. And that shift alters what becomes possible. This is where most people underestimate the process. They expect immediate external change without recognizing the internal and behavioral alignment that must come first. But the system does not skip steps. It follows coherence. When your words, your internal state, and your actions begin to move in the same direction, the results follow naturally. You are not forcing reality into shape. You are aligning with a pattern that allows it to take shape, and that alignment becomes visible in what you touch, what you build, what you create, what you interact with daily. Your environment is not static. It is responsive. It holds the patterns you reinforce, not as something mystical, but as a continuation of how you engage with it. Every object you use, every task you repeat, every space you move through becomes part of this feedback loop. It reflects what you carry into it. It stabilizes what you repeat within it. And over time, it begins to feel consistent with the identity you have been reinforcing. This is how words become anchored. They stop being something you say occasionally and become something that shapes how you exist physically. They are no longer separate from your actions. They guide them. And once they guide them consistently, the outcomes they produce become stable. You are not waiting for reality to catch up to your words. You are allowing your words to move through you into everything you do, until there is no separation between what you say and how you act. And when that separation disappears, something changes in a way that is difficult to reverse. Your words no longer feel like statements you are testing. They feel like something already embedded, something already present, something already active in the way you move through the world. At that point, you are no longer trying to bring something into form. You are already living inside it. Listen to the way you push yourself through a simple task, and you'll hear it, the quiet pressure built into your language. The subtle force behind phrases like, I have to, I should, I need to get this done. It sounds responsible. It sounds disciplined. It even sounds necessary. But beneath that surface, something else is happening. Something you rarely stop to notice. You are placing yourself under command, not by reality, but by the way you speak about it. And the moment you speak from obligation, your entire internal structure shifts. I have to carries weight. It carries resistance before the action even begins. It turns movement into burden, effort into tension, and choice into something that feels removed from you. You are no longer participating in what you are doing, you are being pushed through it. And when that becomes your default language, your entire experience begins to feel like something you are enduring instead of creating. This is not about the task itself. The task remains the same. What changes is the relationship you establish with it through language. Say, I have to do this, and notice how your body reacts. There is a tightening, a subtle reluctance, a sense of pressure that appears immediately. Now shift it. Even slightly, I choose to do this, and something different happens. Not dramatically, not instantly, but enough to feel. The tension softens. The movement becomes less forced. The same action begins to feel like something you are initiating, not something you are being dragged through. That difference is not psychological. It is structural. Language is not just describing your relationship to what you do, it is defining it. And when you repeatedly define your life through obligation, you are constructing a system where you are no longer the one directing. You are reacting to a set of invisible demands, many of which were never consciously chosen. Over time, this becomes your baseline. You stop questioning it. You assume that this is what responsibility feels like, what discipline requires, what life is supposed to be. But discipline is not the same as pressure, and responsibility is not the same as surrendering your authority. You have confused obligation with structure. Structure supports movement. Obligation restricts it. Structure allows you to act with clarity. Obligation forces you to act with resistance, and resistance, even when it produces results, always carries cost. It drains energy. It slows momentum. It turns simple actions into heavy processes that require constant effort to maintain. And the more you repeat this pattern, the more natural it feels, until you no longer recognize that you are the one reinforcing it. Because again, it is not the task, it is the language. The moment you shift from "I must" to "I choose," you are not changing what needs to be done. You are reclaiming the position from which you are doing it. You are stepping out of reaction and back into direction. And that shift, small as it may seem, changes everything that follows. You begin to move differently. When you choose, you engage. When you engage, your attention sharpens. When your attention sharpens, your actions become more precise, and precision reduces friction. You are no longer dragging yourself through something. You are moving through it. This is where sovereignty begins. Not as a concept, but as a lived experience. You are not removing responsibility. You are removing unnecessary resistance. You are not avoiding effort. You are aligning it. And alignment is what allows consistency to become sustainable, because effort driven by obligation eventually collapses. It cannot maintain itself without constant pressure. But movement driven by choice stabilizes. It continues, not because it is forced, but because it is integrated. Look at how often your language pulls you out of that integration. I should be better by now. I have to fix this. I need to figure everything out. Each of these statements carries an underlying assumption that something is wrong, incomplete, insufficient, and that assumption shapes how you move. It creates urgency where it may not be needed. It creates pressure that distorts your focus. It turns growth into something you chase instead of something you build. But when you shift even slightly, I am choosing to improve. I am choosing to learn. I am choosing to move forward. The direction remains the same, but the experience changes. You are no longer chasing a standard imposed from outside. You are creating movement from within, and that distinction is where authority returns. Authority does not come from controlling everything. It comes from recognizing that the way you speak determines how you position yourself within your own life. You can place yourself under pressure, or you can place yourself in direction. You can speak as someone being pushed, or as someone moving. The world responds differently to each. When you move from obligation, your actions carry hesitation. You anticipate resistance. You prepare for difficulty. And those subtle shifts influence everything that follows. But when you move from choice, your actions carry clarity. You are not negotiating with yourself constantly. You are not splitting your energy between wanting and resisting. You are aligned. And alignment reduces friction not just internally, but externally. Situations begin to feel less forced. Decisions become more direct. The same environment that once felt heavy begins to feel more responsive. Not because it changed, but because your way of engaging with it did. This is why language is architecture. It builds the structure you move within. Every repeated phrase lays another layer. Every consistent pattern reinforces the design. And over time, you begin to live inside the structure you have been constructing through your words. If that structure is built on obligation, it will feel restrictive, no matter what you achieve within it. If it is built on choice, it will feel expansive, even when the tasks remain demanding. You are not trying to eliminate difficulty. You are removing unnecessary weight, and that weight is often hidden in the way you speak. The moment you begin to notice it, not occasionally, but consistently, something shifts. You hear the difference. You feel the difference. And in that awareness, you gain the ability to adjust. Not forcefully, but deliberately. You start replacing pressure with direction, not perfectly, not all at once, but enough. Enough to change the way you move. And once the way you move changes, the structure you are living inside begins to reorganize. Not because you demanded it, but because you stopped reinforcing the pattern that was keeping it rigid. At that point, you are no longer trying to manage your life. You are shaping the position from which it unfolds. Say the exact same sentence twice and watch how differently it lands depending on what you carry beneath it. Because the words themselves are only the surface, a thin outline that hides the current moving underneath. You can speak about confidence and still feel contraction. Speak about ease while your body prepares for resistance. Repeat something that sounds aligned while something quieter, deeper, continues to pull in the opposite direction. And that deeper movement is what determines which pattern actually stabilizes. You have been paying attention to language, to repetition, to alignment. But there is another layer you have been sensing without fully naming it. Something that does not always form into clear sentences. Something that moves faster than thought and settles deeper than words ever can. That layer is emotion, not as a fleeting feeling, but as a continuous state. A background signal that shapes everything you say before you say it. Emotion is not a reaction to your words. It is the foundation they emerge from. This is why two identical statements can produce completely different results. Not because the wording changed, but because the state beneath it did. When your words are supported by a steady internal feeling, something coherent forms. The signal becomes clear. It carries direction. But when your words are layered on top of tension, doubt, or resistance, they fragment. They do not hold. They dissolve before they can stabilize into anything consistent. And most of the time, you are not even aware of this layer. You hear what you say, but you do not always feel what is driving it. You repeat something that sounds right, but something underneath remains unchanged, and that unchanged layer continues to shape your experience. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently enough to override whatever you are trying to establish on the surface. This is where frustration begins, because you start to believe that your words are not working, that repetition is ineffective, that something is missing, when in reality, nothing is missing. There is simply a mismatch. The language is moving in one direction, the emotional current in another, and that split prevents anything from settling into a stable pattern. Emotion does not need to be intense to be powerful. It needs to be consistent. A quiet, repeated feeling will always outweigh a loud, occasional statement, because what repeats becomes familiar, and what becomes familiar becomes the baseline your system organizes around. You may say something once with certainty, but if the underlying feeling returns to doubt repeatedly, doubt becomes the dominant pattern, not because it is stronger, but because it is sustained. This is why forcing emotion does not work. Trying to generate excitement or confidence on demand often creates more tension, because it is not aligned with what is already present. And that tension becomes part of the signal, adding another layer of contradiction. You are no longer just saying something different. You are resisting what you feel while trying to impose something else on top of it. That resistance does not disappear. It embeds itself. So the shift does not begin with changing emotion directly. It begins with recognizing it, not analyzing it, not judging it, not trying to fix it immediately, but allowing yourself to notice what is actually there beneath your words. The tone, the subtle pull, the expectation that forms before any clear thought appears. Because the moment you become aware of that layer, it stops operating completely unnoticed, and awareness changes how it behaves. You are no longer fully inside it. You are observing it. And in that observation, space appears. Not a large space, not something dramatic, but enough. Enough to prevent automatic reinforcement. Enough to interrupt repetition. Enough to begin shifting direction. Because emotion, like language, follows patterns. It returns to what it knows. It repeats what has been reinforced. And just like words, it can be redirected. Not through force, but through consistency. You begin to introduce slight adjustments, not by pretending to feel something you don't, but by choosing responses that do not deepen the existing pattern. If tension is present, you do not amplify it with language that confirms it. If doubt appears, you do not repeat it as fact. You allow it to exist without building around it, and in doing so, you weaken its repetition. At the same time, you begin to stabilize a different tone, not through intensity, but through subtle consistency. Small acknowledgments, slight shifts in how you frame things, gentle redirections that do not create resistance. And over time, these small shifts accumulate. The emotional baseline begins to move, not suddenly, not in a way that feels dramatic, but steadily enough that your words start to feel more supported, less forced, more natural. The gap between what you say and what you feel begins to close, and when that gap closes, coherence forms. That is where your words gain weight, not because they became more powerful, but because they are no longer divided. You are not trying to override your internal state anymore. You are allowing it to evolve alongside your language, step by step, until they move together. And when they move together, the signal becomes clear. Clarity does not need to be loud. It needs to be uninterrupted. Once your emotional current and your language align, something stabilizes. Your statements no longer feel like attempts. They feel like extensions of something already present, and that presence carries forward into how you act, how you perceive, how you respond to what unfolds around you. You are no longer managing two directions at once. You are moving in one, and when movement becomes unified, everything begins to organize around that unity. Not because you forced it, but because there is no longer anything inside you pulling it apart. What you say matters, but what you carry beneath what you say determines whether it holds or dissolves. And once you begin to feel that difference, not as an idea, but as something you can recognize in real time, you stop trying to fix your words. You start listening to what they are built on. Right before you speak, there is a fraction of a second you usually pass through without noticing. A brief, almost weightless pause where nothing has been said yet, but something is already forming. And that space, small as it seems, determines more than the words that follow it. You move through it too quickly to recognize it, filling it immediately with the first familiar phrase that rises. But that is exactly why your language keeps repeating itself. You are not choosing your words from awareness. You are continuing a pattern that never had a chance to be interrupted. That unnoticed space is where everything begins. You have been taught to focus on what to say, how to say it, how often to repeat it, but very little attention has been given to what happens before the words arrive. And yet, that moment is the source, not the words themselves, not the repetition, not even the emotion beneath them, but the silent space where all of it emerges. Silence is not absence. It is potential. When you rush through it, you default. When you stay in it, even briefly, something different becomes available. You are no longer reacting automatically. You are no longer finishing a sentence that started long before the current moment. You are present at the point where direction can actually change. Most of your inner dialogue does not begin fresh. It continues. One thought leads into another. One phrase completes the previous one. And before you realize it, you are inside a stream that has been running for years. The words feel immediate, but they are not new. They are echoes. And because you move through the silent space without awareness, those echoes remain uninterrupted. But when you begin to notice the pause, even for a second, the continuity breaks. You hear the beginning of a familiar phrase, and instead of completing it automatically, you stay. You don't rush to fill the gap. You don't force a new statement. You simply remain in that space long enough to recognize that you are about to repeat something you have said countless times before. That recognition changes the direction, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to prevent the old pattern from locking in again. You are not suppressing it. You are not replacing it instantly. You are allowing it to dissolve by not completing it. This is where true speech begins, not in the words themselves, but in the awareness that precedes them. Because once you are aware of the space, you are no longer limited to what has always followed it. You can allow something different to emerge, not through force, but through presence, and presence slows everything down just enough for you to feel what you are about to say before you say it, just enough to notice whether it aligns with the direction you have been building or whether it pulls you back into something familiar, just enough to choose, even slightly. Instead of repeating unconsciously, at first, this feels unfamiliar. You are used to speed. You are used to immediate reaction. Silence can feel uncomfortable, almost like something is missing, like you should fill it quickly before it becomes noticeable. But that discomfort is not a problem. It is a sign that you are no longer moving automatically. You are interrupting the rhythm. And once the rhythm is interrupted, something new can begin to form. Words that come from silence carry a different quality. They are not rushed. They are not reactive. They do not need to be corrected immediately after being spoken. They feel grounded, not because they are perfect, but because they are aligned with the moment they arise from. This is why speaking less often, but with awareness, changes more than speaking constantly without it. It is not about reducing words. It is about changing where they come from. When words come from noise, they continue noise. When they come from silence, they carry clarity. And clarity stabilizes patterns much faster than repetition without awareness ever could. You begin to notice this in conversations. You respond instead of reacting. You listen more fully, not because you are trying to, but because you are not already preparing your next sentence. You allow space between what you hear and what you say. And in that space, your response becomes more precise. The same shift happens internally. Your inner dialogue slows. Not completely, not all at once, but enough that you can hear it more clearly. Enough that you can recognize when a pattern is about to repeat. Enough that you can stay in the space instead of filling it immediately. And in that staying, something else becomes possible. You begin to experience moments where no words are needed at all. Not because you are avoiding them, but because nothing needs to be reinforced in that moment. The state is already stable. The direction is already clear. And adding language would not strengthen it. It would only repeat what is already present. This is where silence becomes powerful. Not as something you use, but as something you allow, because in silence, there is no contradiction. There is no split. There is no interruption. It is the only place where your internal state can exist without being shaped by automatic language. And when that state is clear, the words that eventually emerge from it carry that clarity forward. You are no longer speaking to fix something. You are speaking from something, and that difference changes everything. You are not trying to control your language anymore. You are returning to the point where language begins. And from that point, what you say is no longer a continuation of the past. It is something that belongs to the present moment, something that was not already decided. And once you become familiar with that space, once you stop rushing to fill it, once you allow it to exist without needing to escape it, you begin to realize that the most important part of what you say is not the words themselves. It is where they come from. Energy does not disappear inside you. It changes form. What you call frustration, what you call pain, what you call restlessness or intensity. None of it is wasted. None of it is meaningless. None of it exists as an obstacle unless you hold it in place without direction. And yet, most of the time, that is exactly what happens. You feel something rise, something strong, something uncomfortable, and instead of understanding it as movement, you label it, resist it, or try to suppress it. And in that moment, the energy stops flowing and begins to loop. That loop is what creates stagnation. You think you are overwhelmed by what you feel, but in reality, you are holding it in a fixed position, repeating it internally, reinforcing it through language, stabilizing it into something that no longer moves. The feeling itself is not the problem. The repetition around it is. This is where passion and healing meet, not as separate processes, but as two directions the same energy can take. Passion is not something you add. It is something that is already present when energy is allowed to move without resistance. It is intensity with direction. It is what happens when what you feel is not blocked, not suppressed, not turned against itself, but guided forward into expression. And healing is not about removing that intensity. It is about releasing the patterns that keep it trapped. You have been taught to treat strong emotion as something to manage, something to control, something that needs to be calmed down before you can function properly. But that approach misses something essential. The intensity itself is not the issue. The lack of direction is. When energy has no direction, it turns inward. It repeats. It amplifies. It becomes heavier. Not because it is meant to be heavy, but because it is not moving. And the more it repeats without release, the more it defines your state, until it begins to feel like part of your identity. I am this way. I always feel like this. This is just how I react. These are not descriptions. They are stabilizations. You are taking something that was meant to move and turning it into something that remains. And once it remains long enough, it feels permanent. But it is not permanent. It is just uninterrupted. The moment you allow that energy to move, something changes, not because you forced it, not because you controlled it, but because you stopped holding it in place. And movement does not always look like what you expect. It is not always dramatic. It is not always expressive in obvious ways. Sometimes it is simply a shift in how you speak about what you feel. Sometimes it is choosing not to repeat the same interpretation. Sometimes it is allowing the sensation to exist without immediately defining it. That is where transmutation begins. You are not turning something negative into something positive. You are allowing it to continue moving until it no longer needs to be labeled at all. And as it moves, it changes. It loses the form it had when it was fixed. It becomes something else, something lighter, something that can be directed instead of endured. This is where passion emerges naturally, not as forced motivation, not as something you try to create, but as the same energy that once felt heavy now moving freely in a different direction. The intensity remains, but the resistance is gone, and without resistance, intensity becomes clarity. It becomes focus. It becomes drive. You are not adding anything new. You are releasing what was blocking what was already there, and this changes the way you relate to everything you feel. You stop seeing discomfort as something to avoid. You stop trying to silence every strong reaction. You begin to recognize that what you feel is not fixed. It is dynamic. It is meant to move. And when you allow it to move, it does not control you. It becomes available to you. The same energy that once felt like anxiety becomes awareness when it is not resisted. The same energy that felt like frustration becomes precision when it is directed. The same intensity that felt overwhelming becomes momentum when it is allowed to flow. But this requires one thing that most people overlook. You cannot keep reinforcing the old story while expecting the energy to change. If you continue to repeat the same language around what you feel, you anchor it in place. You prevent it from moving. You turn a temporary state into a stable pattern. And once it stabilizes, it no longer feels like something passing through you. It feels like something that defines you. So the shift is not in eliminating the feeling. It is in how you relate to it. You begin to notice the moment where a sensation arises and a familiar interpretation follows. And instead of completing that interpretation automatically, you pause, not to suppress it, not to replace it immediately, but to allow the energy to exist without being fixed into the same pattern again. That pause changes everything, because without repetition, the pattern cannot stabilize. And without stabilization, the energy continues to move. And when it continues to move, it eventually finds a new direction. You do not control that direction through force. You influence it through what you reinforce next. This is where your words return, not as something separate from what you feel, but as something that can guide it, not by denying the intensity, but by allowing it to shift gradually, step by step, into something that aligns with where you are moving. And over time, something becomes clear. What you once tried to eliminate becomes something you can use. What once felt like an obstacle becomes a source of movement. What once seemed like something holding you back becomes the very force that moves you forward. Once it is no longer trapped, you are not breaking yourself down to rebuild something new. You are allowing what is already there to reorganize, to move, to transform, simply because you stopped holding it in place. And when that movement becomes natural, when you no longer resist what arises, when you no longer repeat it into something fixed, you begin to experience a different kind of stability. Not the stability of control, but the stability of flow, where nothing inside you needs to be forced into silence, and nothing needs to remain stuck. The way you introduce yourself is not limited to what you say out loud to other people. It is happening continuously, quietly, in the phrases you repeat about who you are, what you can handle, what belongs to you, and what does not. You are naming yourself all the time, not once, not occasionally, but constantly, through language so familiar that you no longer recognize it as something you are choosing. And over time, those repeated statements stop sounding like descriptions and begin functioning as boundaries, not boundaries imposed on you, but boundaries you reinforce. You say something about yourself enough times and it becomes a line you no longer cross, not because you tested it thoroughly, not because it was proven in every situation, but because it was repeated until it felt stable. I'm not that kind of person. I don't do well in situations like this. This is where I usually fail. These phrases do not just explain past experiences. They project them forward. They set the conditions for what you allow yourself to step into next. And the more you repeat them, the more natural they feel. The more natural they feel, the less you question them. And the less you question them, the more they define the range of actions you consider possible. This is how identity forms. not through a single realization, but through accumulation. You are not becoming someone new in one moment. You are reinforcing a version of yourself through repetition until it feels consistent enough to trust. And once you trust it, you begin to act from it, not consciously, not deliberately, but automatically. Your choices align with it. Your reactions support it. Your expectations reflect it. And from the outside, it appears as if this is simply who you are. But what feels like identity is often just repetition that was never interrupted. Look closely at how quickly this shapes behavior. You approach a situation, and before anything unfolds, a familiar statement appears. I'm not good at this. That statement does not wait for evidence. It arrives first. And because it arrives first, it filters everything that follows. You notice mistakes more quickly. You interpret uncertainty as confirmation. You withdraw slightly, even if you don't realize it. And those small shifts influence the outcome. Then, the outcome reinforces the statement. And the loop continues. You are not discovering who you are. You are confirming who you have been saying you are. This is why changing identity feels difficult. Not because identity is fixed, but because it is repeated. And anything repeated long enough becomes stable. It becomes the baseline you return to when you are not paying attention. But the same mechanism that built it can reshape it, not through denial, not through pretending to be someone else, but through changing what you consistently declare about yourself. Because every declaration, repeated often enough, becomes a reference point. And once it becomes a reference point, it begins to influence how you see, how you act, how you respond. You are not forcing a new identity into place. You are allowing a different one to stabilize. And that stabilization does not happen through a single statement. It happens through continuity, through returning to the same direction often enough that it begins to feel natural. At first, the new language feels unfamiliar. It does not carry the same weight. It does not feel as convincing. But that is not because it is untrue. It is because it has not been repeated enough to become stable. You have been trusting repetition, not truth. And once you understand that, something shifts. You stop waiting to feel different before you speak differently. You begin to speak in a way that allows something different to form, not aggressively, not forcefully, but consistently. You introduce new statements about yourself that do not contradict your current state but extend it slightly beyond where it has been. Instead of, I'm not good at this, you move to, I'm learning how to handle this. Instead of, this always goes wrong, you move to, this can move differently. These shifts may seem small, but they do something important. They remove finality. They create space, and space is what allows identity to change, because identity is not a fixed structure. It is a pattern that stabilizes when repeated without interruption. When you interrupt it, even slightly, it begins to loosen. It no longer feels absolute, and in that loosening, something new can begin to take shape. Over time, the new language becomes easier to return to. You no longer have to search for it as much. It begins to appear automatically in situations where the old pattern used to dominate, and when it appears automatically, it begins to carry weight. That is when identity starts to shift, not when you declare something once, but when it becomes what you return to without thinking, because whatever you return to defines how you move, and how you move determines what you experience, and what you experience reinforces what you believe. The loop does not disappear. It changed direction. You are no longer confirming limitation. You are stabilizing possibility, and as that possibility repeats, it begins to feel less like something you are trying to believe and more like something that is already part of you. This is where identity stops feeling like something you are constructing and starts feeling like something you are stepping into, not all at once, not perfectly, but steadily enough that the difference becomes noticeable. You respond differently. You approach situations with less hesitation. You interpret outcomes with more flexibility. And these changes, though subtle, accumulate. They create a new set of experiences. And those experiences reinforce the new pattern. You are not becoming someone else. You are becoming consistent with what you declare. And once that consistency stabilizes, the question of who you are no longer feels uncertain. Not because you proved it in every situation, but because you stopped repeating the version that kept you limited. Identity is not discovered. It is established, And whatever you establish through repetition becomes the version of yourself that feels real. You keep placing your life somewhere else without realizing how often you do it, pushing things forward into a future that hasn't arrived, or pulling yourself backward into moments that no longer exist. Speaking about what will happen, what should have happened, what might happen, until the only place where anything can actually move the present becomes something you pass through without fully entering. And yet, every pattern you have been building, every word you have been repeating, every identity you have been reinforcing, only has power in one place, right here. But the way you speak rarely stays here. Listen to how often your language leans away from the present. I will be ready. Things will get better. One day this will change. These statements may sound hopeful, even motivating, but they carry a hidden structure that keeps what you want just out of reach. Not because the future is wrong, but because you keep positioning yourself outside of what you are trying to stabilize. You are always approaching it, never standing in it, and the system you are operating within does not respond to where you are going. It responds to where you are speaking from. If your language places what you want in the future, the pattern stabilizes as something not yet present. It becomes something you move toward but never fully occupy. And because you never occupy it, it never becomes your baseline. It remains distant, not physically, but structurally. This is why progress can feel endless, like you are always getting closer but never arriving, not because you are failing, but because your language keeps extending the distance. The same thing happens when you move backward. You repeat what has already happened, reinforcing past outcomes as if they are still active. I always struggled with this. This is how it went before. These statements may seem like simple observations, but they anchor your perception to what has already been experienced. They keep the past active in your present language, and anything repeated in the present becomes part of your current pattern. So you are not just remembering the past, you are maintaining it. This is where presence becomes more than awareness. It becomes direction. When your language returns to now, something shifts. Not dramatically, not instantly, but structurally. You are no longer describing something that might happen or something that already happened. You are stabilizing something that is active. I am learning this. This is moving. I am handling this. These statements do not push anything away. They do not create distance. They place you inside the process, inside the movement, inside the experience as it is happening, and when you are inside it, the pattern begins to stabilize. Presence is not about slowing everything down or forcing yourself to stay focused. It is about removing the habit of placing your experience somewhere else. It is about recognizing how often your language disconnects you from the only point where change can occur, because nothing stabilizes in the past. Nothing stabilizes in the future. It stabilizes in what you are consistently reinforcing now. You do not need to feel perfect to speak from the present. You do not need to eliminate uncertainty. But you do need to notice when your language is moving you away from where you are. Because every time you do that, you weaken the pattern you are trying to build. You turn something active into something distant. And distance is what prevents stabilization. This is why presence feels different from effort. Effort often pushes forward, trying to reach something ahead. Presence holds position. It does not rush. It does not stretch. It stabilizes what is already being reinforced. At first, this can feel unfamiliar. You are used to thinking in terms of progress, of getting somewhere, of becoming something later. Speaking from now may feel incomplete, as if you are not acknowledging the full journey. But in reality, it is the only way the journey moves, because movement happens within the present, not toward it. You begin to notice how your perception changes when your language stays here. Situations feel less distant. Actions feel more direct. You are not preparing for something. You are already inside it. And that shift reduces hesitation, reduces overthinking, reduces the need to constantly evaluate whether you are getting closer. You are not measuring distance anymore. You are reinforcing position, and when position stabilizes, movement follows naturally, not because you forced it, but because there is no longer a gap between where you are and what you are building. You are not reaching for it. You are speaking from within it. This is how time changes its role. It stops being something you wait through and becomes something that reflects what you are stabilizing. You are no longer dependent on future moments to validate what you are building. You are establishing it in the present. and that establishment begins to shape what follows. You are not skipping steps. You are removing unnecessary delay, because delay is often not in the process itself. It is in how you speak about it. When your language constantly projects forward, you extend the timeline. When it anchors backward, you repeat what has already been. But when it remains in the present, it allows continuity. It allows patterns to build without interruption, and continuity is what creates stability. You do not need to rush the outcome. You need to remain in the position that allows it to form. That position is always now, not as a concept, not as something you remind yourself occasionally, but as a way of speaking, a way of reinforcing, a way of aligning your words with the only point where they can actually take hold. Because the moment you consistently speak from where you are, instead of where you think you should be, something changes in how everything unfolds. You stop chasing time, and time stops feeling like something you are behind. You tighten without noticing it, not just in your body, but in the way you think, the way you speak, the way you approach everything that matters to you. A subtle grip forms around outcomes, around timing, around how things should unfold. And that grip feels like responsibility, like focus, like effort applied in the right direction. But beneath it, something else is happening. You are trying to control what has never responded well to control. And the more you tighten, the more resistance you feel. You have been taught, in one form or another, that if you want something badly enough, you must hold on to it. Think about it constantly. Monitor it. Manage every detail. Make sure nothing goes wrong. And for a while, this feels productive. It gives you the sense that you are doing something, that you are moving forward, that you are not leaving anything to chance. But over time, it becomes exhausting, not because you lack discipline, but because control, when it comes from tension, creates friction that cannot sustain itself. You are not just holding on to what you want, you are holding it in place. And when something is held too tightly, it cannot move. This is where surrender begins. Not as giving up, not as stepping back from what matters, but as releasing the need to force the process into a specific shape, because forcing implies that something is not already moving, that something needs to be pushed, adjusted, corrected. But much of what you are trying to control is already unfolding, just not always in the way you expect. The problem is not that movement is absent. The problem is that you are interrupting it. Every time you overanalyze, every time you repeat the same concern, every time you try to predict or prevent what has not yet happened, you introduce friction into a process that could have remained fluid. You are not accelerating it, you are slowing it down. And yet, letting go of control feels dangerous at first, because control has been your way of staying engaged. It has been your way of feeling responsible. It has been your way of believing that you are doing everything you can. Without it, there is a sense of uncertainty, a feeling that something might slip, that something might go wrong if you are not constantly managing it. But that fear is not coming from reality. It is coming from habit. You have associated control with safety, with progress, with results, and so releasing it feels like stepping into something unstructured. But in truth, what you are stepping into is not chaos. It is allowance. Allowance is not passive. It is not indifference. It is not neglect. It is alignment without force. It is continuing to move, to act, to speak, but without the tension of needing everything to happen in a specific way. It is trusting the direction you have been reinforcing without constantly checking whether it is working. It is allowing the process to unfold without interrupting it every few moments with doubt or adjustment. This changes how you experience everything. You are no longer pushing outcomes. You are participating in them. Your actions remain. Your attention remains. Your direction remains. But the pressure is gone. The constant monitoring fades. The need to evaluate every step disappears. And in that absence, something unexpected happens. Things begin to move more smoothly. Not because you are doing more, but because you are interfering less. You start to notice that situations unfold without needing to be forced. Conversations find their direction without you rehearsing every word. Decisions become clearer without you analyzing every possibility. Opportunities appear without you chasing them constantly. This is not luck. It is the result of removing resistance. Control often disguises itself as effort, but effort and tension are not the same. Effort can exist within flow. Tension cannot. And when tension is removed, effort becomes more effective, more precise, more aligned with the direction you are already moving in. This is why surrender is not about doing less. It is about doing without strain. You are still engaged. You are still present. You are still moving. But you are no longer trying to shape every outcome manually. You are allowing the patterns you have been building to organize themselves. And this requires trust. Not blind trust. Not passive belief. But trust built through recognition. You have already seen how your words shape your patterns. You have already seen how repetition stabilizes direction. You have already seen how alignment reduces resistance. Surrender is the continuation of that process, not its opposite. You are not stepping away from what you have been building. You are allowing it to move without being held back by constant interference. At first, this feels unfamiliar. You may notice moments where you want to go back, to check, to adjust, to make sure everything is still on track. And that impulse is natural. It is the echo of the old pattern. But each time you recognize it and allow it to pass without acting on it, you weaken it. You create space for a different way of moving, and in that space, stability begins to form. Not the stability of control, but the stability of trust in the direction you are holding. You no longer need to prove it constantly. You no longer need to reinforce it with tension. It begins to carry itself. That is when you realize something important. You were never in control of every detail. You were only controlling your relationship to what was unfolding. And that relationship, once it shifts from force to allowance, changes how everything is experienced. You are no longer pushing against what is happening. You are moving with it. And when you move with it, you stop asking whether things will work. You continue. At some point, you stop needing to repeat things to yourself the way you once did. Not because repetition failed, but because it fulfilled its purpose. The patterns you built have settled. The direction you reinforced has stabilized. And the words that once felt necessary begin to fall away. Not all at once, not deliberately, but naturally. Like something you no longer need to carry because it has already become part of you. This is not the absence of language. It is the absence of dependency on it. You spent so long shaping your inner dialogue, refining it, to aligning it, noticing where it conflicted and where it supported you. And through that process, something deeper was forming underneath. The words were never the destination. They were the bridge. And now that you have crossed it, you begin to realize that what you were building was not better language, but a different state of being altogether. You no longer need to convince yourself of anything. Not because everything is perfect, not because every outcome is guaranteed, but because the need to constantly reinforce your direction has dissolved. What you once had to repeat consciously now exists without effort. It has become your baseline. And when something becomes your baseline, it does not need to be reminded. This is where unity begins to be felt. Not as an idea, not as a philosophy, but as a direct experience. There is no longer a clear separation between what you say and what you feel, between what you intend and how you move, between your inner state and what unfolds around you. The gaps that once created tension, the contradictions that once split your direction, have been reduced to the point where they no longer dominate your experience. Everything moves in one direction, not because you are forcing it, but because nothing inside you is pulling against it. And in that absence of internal conflict, something becomes quiet, not empty, not passive, but still. This stillness is not something you create. It appears when there is nothing left that needs to be corrected, adjusted, or reinforced. The constant commentary that once filled your mind begins to fade, not because you silenced it, but because it no longer has a function to serve. You are not trying to change anything in that moment. You are not trying to become anything. You are simply present in what is already established, and that presence carries a different kind of clarity. You no longer need to analyze every situation. You no longer need to interpret everything through a pattern you are trying to maintain. You see more directly. You respond more simply. And that simplicity is not a lack of depth. It is the result of depth that no longer needs to be processed through constant thought. This is what mastery feels like. Not as control, not as perfection, but as the absence of unnecessary effort. You are still aware. You are still engaged. But you are no longer working against yourself. The system that once required attention, repetition, and adjustment is now operating without conscious management. The direction is stable, the movement is continuous, and because it is continuous, it no longer needs to be restarted or reinforced at every step. You trust it, not because you decided to trust it, but because you have experienced its consistency. And in that trust, something else disappears. The need to measure. You are no longer checking whether you are progressing, whether things are working, whether you are getting closer. Those questions belong to a state where direction was uncertain. But now, direction is not something you are questioning. It is something you are living from. And when you live from it, measurement becomes irrelevant. You are not moving towards something, you are moving within it. This is where language reaches its limit, not because words are insufficient, but because they are no longer required to hold the structure you have built. You can still use them. You can still speak, still express, still define when needed. But you are no longer dependent on them to maintain your state. They become optional, not foundational. And beyond that, there is silence, not the silence of absence, but the silence of completion, a space where nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be repeated. Nothing needs to be corrected. A space where your presence itself carries what your words once had to construct, where the way you exist is already aligned with the direction you spent so long reinforcing. You do not need to say it anymore, because you are it. And in that, something final settles, not as an ending, but as a return to something that was always there, beneath the noise, beneath the repetition, beneath the effort, a state that does not need to be reached, only uncovered. You are no longer building the pattern, you are living inside it.